And we are live and right on cue.
I
hear it. Oh, no howls.
Not yet.
Maybe they're a minute delayed.
They're late tonight.
I was going to say it's the howl to get the party started. So, hello everybody. Today is another episode. I'm your host. You know me by now, but who you don't know is who we're pulling on tonight. Tonight's episode is Isle of Video Games. Whoop whoop! A fun topic that I think a lot of us are going to enjoy. So, joining me tonight and helping with talk about video games as well as share some personal stories, I would like to welcome on Bueller.
Hey, what's going on? I'm excited. I get to talk about video games, not comic books, because I always just talk about comics. But video games has been one of my passions from very young and still is today. So I get the opportunity to share some of my stories about video games and my time in the video game industry. And I'm looking forward to it. So thanks for having me on tonight.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And when you had mentioned video games, when we were setting up your topic, I was like, oh, you understand the rabbit hole we could fall into. Because I am a very, very heavy video game player myself, which probably isn't good. So, but thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everybody who is tailgating in the chat. And I want to mention everyone, I wonder now if you can hear, instead of howling, we had somebody revving their truck outside.
We have fireworks.
We have fireworks and a truck revving, but I haven't heard a howl yet. So, but thank you to Metarog and Bear Island, and I see Kurt Brown. Thank you all so much for tailgating. I know I saw some more people, but my feed is very delayed.
Rob is here.
Rob is here. I know mine lags. I'm like,
your uncle is here.
Hi. Okay, so video games. Here we go. Oh, hi. Hi. Wrong side. All right. So, I wanted to ask you why you had mentioned video games as a potential topic. Because, and it's more of, I want to ask, what video games mean to you, and what is your favorite video game and why?
Well, I was into video games when I was really young. My dad he kind of sold, for a certain time, he sold movie projectors and electronics to schools, and he had access to all this electronic equipment very early on when I was a little kid. So he'd bring home big, huge projectors and big screens, and he'd bring home the Atari, and we'd play Pac-Man on a big, huge 12-foot screen.
Oh, that would be
brothers
so
and sisters.
Fun.
And I was the youngest out of all my brothers and sisters, so I was always the last one to play. So I'd sit there and just watch a few hours, and then I'd finally get a chance to play. And so I always enjoyed all that stuff, and just the fact that there was so many kids in my family, I wasn't playing by myself. I had other people to play against, play Pac-Man, play Dig Dug, or Joust was another one. And I always got the hand-me-down. So it's they'd get a new system, and I'd get their old system, which is great, which I didn't mind at all. And every now and then when they'd go and leave, I'd sneak into their bedroom and play their new machine, and then put everything back so it didn't look like I was in there messing around.
Right?
Yeah. But I've always loved video games. It's kind of video games is right there with comic books as far as where my passion was. And then it was always easier to find people who were in the video games as opposed to being in the comic books. There's a lot of gamers out there. So there was no shortage of people I went to school with, grade school, that didn't like video games. They all did. So we all had that in common. So I enjoyed playing them from a very early age, and it stayed with me all through my life. And my profession that I was in before this type of thing was the video game world. And then, I still play casually. So a lot of great games. You'd ask me my favorite game. You want to know that one? My favorite game all time is Fallout 3. Fallout 3.
I just saw Bear Island mention he's like, nobody's going to judge me if I play Fallout during this.
Fallout is by far, and the thing is, I remember I got that game for the Xbox 360, and I got it, and I played it for 10 minutes, and I just put it on my shelf, and I didn't pay any attention to it for a half a year. And then one time I was home and I was sick, and I was just, I'll pop this in and start playing it, and then literally like 5 days later, I woke up from playing Fallout for 5 straight days. I mean, literally ever since then, I will play through that game over and over and over. It's the same game; it doesn't change.
Wow.
But it's so fun to do, and just it's kind of like a post-apocalyptic world. You can level up your guy, and you just walk around, and there's nothing around you. I don't know. I don't know if you ever played it, but if you haven't, they've made a lot of Fallout games, but Fallout 3 was the first one that was 3D and everything. And it's just amazing. I hope they remake it.
Ooh, especially with all of like their new like, especially with like, because not that Fallout 3 is like, but if Fallout 3 had the original like the 3D like animations, imagine what they could do with like some of the stuff that they're using for like the Nintendos or the new Xboxes and stuff like that. Ooh,
they've actually made a VR version of the Fallout 4. But honestly, I didn't like 4 as much. I thought like they've made Fallout 3 came out over 10 years ago. And to me, it's still the best one. They've made like 3 or 4 other ones. But to me, that one is still the best one. It's still the one I go back to.
So that does lead me to ask, which do you prefer? Do you like retro video games more because it is that tie with your childhood and, getting to play on the giant screen? Or do you like more modern because like Fallout 3 has like some of the newer animation styles that video games had seen?
Well, it's so nice to see from where video games started to where they are now, as far as what I played when I was a little kid, and to see the graphics and the little sprite on the screen. There's one little dot moving around. That's about it. And then to what things are today, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing what the technology has done over the last very short period of time. It's only been about 20 or 30 years, but to come from that to what we are now to almost better than real life is just fantastic. So when I look at games, and if I were to compare retro and more modern games, they're totally different. The retro games are great, and they're simpler, I guess, and they're nice to just kind of jump into for a few minutes. Like I can sit and play a game of Ms. Pac-Man for a half hour and be like, man, that was awesome. Love playing Ms. Pac-Man, one of my favorites. But then I go into the more modern games like the Fallouts or Destiny, which is another game that ate up so much of my time, and there's so much to do. It's so massive, and there's so many details. So for the retro games, little bits and pieces, like a little quick game if you want to play for like 30 minutes, perfect. For something you want to dive more deep in and invest hundreds and hundreds of hours, which I have, the modern stuff can't be touched.
So you prefer modern then?
Yeah, but I mean, I still go like. Have you ever played the board game Ticket to Ride?
I don't think I have. No.
Okay, it's a great board game. They just translated it to a video game format. It's very basic. It literally takes about 10 minutes to play a game on your machine, and there's really the graphics on there are nothing. I love that. I love just taking the 10 minutes, play a quick little game. It's been around a long time, and for that 10 minutes, I'm entertained, and that's what's important. So I was on a kick for that one for a little while, but yeah, the modern ones, the detail that goes into them, and just the fact that everything that you can do, it's amazing. So I enjoy those.
Now, I did have this pop into my head as you were talking about, like, having your old little sprite move across the screen and whatnot. And you were talking about playing, like Dig Dug and Pac-Man. Did you ever play Mappy by chance?
Mappy.
Does anybody know what the Mappy game is?
Oh, I do. I do.
What's the Mappy?
Okay, so Mappy was a game. What was it came with the actual set.
Old.
So we because it's kind of this is also kind of like weird for me talking about like retro games compared to new games, because I am kind of the
yes. Roger knows.
Yes. because I remember, I'm kind of the generation that saw everything change. I remember when my house used to have an old landline
Well,
phone.
I was there.
You were sure you were
weren't
there,
even
but-
born yet.
Okay, yes, but I remember you guys playing Mappy, and I sucked
No,
at it.
so when one of my first game systems, was the old stick controllers where you had your box and they designed the outside of the box, and you just had your two buttons and that was a few sets of our first ever games, and we would hook it up to our VCR and play. Well, we had one that had tons of all those old retro games on it. It had Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man. It had Galaxia, is that what it is?
Oh, I
The
don't
playing
know.
game. But one of them was Mappy, and you play as this cop mouse, and your
Okay. I know who you're talking about now.
yeah, and your objective is to go around and steal back all the things that these cat burglars have stolen. I was so good at that game.
You were good at that game.
Because me and Mom would have marathon sessions where we would try and beat each other's high scores and or levels just to see who could get farther into the game.
Yeah.
And I got pretty far along. I think I got to like almost the end of the rainbow
You were
worlds.
pretty good.
We have to look up what all those are. Anyway, but so while on the subject of video games, you had mentioned something to me that I found very interesting and I wanted to ask you about. You actually worked for GameStop for 10 years.
I want to do that.
Cade's first job.
It's a favorite place, I swear.
And on top of the 10 years at GameStop, you then worked on Xbox projects for 2 years.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, what had you go into working for GameStop, and how did you kind of get into it?
Well, like I said, I was always a fan of games, so I had that going for me.
Mhm.
And I was actually working. This is actually before it was called GameStop. It was actually called. There was two different brands. There was a place called Babbage's and Software Etc. And they were both the same company, which later became GameStop when they merged all the different franchises that they bought out. So at the time, when I first started, I was working for Software Etc. And what it was, I was working at a mall. And I was working at one of those little kiosk things that are like in the middle of the mall that sell like little trinkets and stuff.
Right.
And I was working at that, and the little kiosk thing was like right outside of Software Etc. So I look over to my left, and that's their store was right there. So I
Wow.
became friends with the manager and everyone there, and eventually I got tired of working at that kiosk. And I was pretty young, I was like 19, 20 years old. And so they offered me a job as an assistant manager at a Software Etc. store that was inside a Barnes and Noble. It was it was literally it was inside a Barnes and Noble bookstore, and they had a section roped off, like almost with book cabinets and stuff, and that section was Software Etc. So that's where I started. That store didn't last. I mean, that little venture that they took into putting software and stuff like that into Barnes and Noble didn't last. And I don't know if you know this, but Barnes and Noble owned Babbage's and Software Etc. And the same gentleman that owned GameStop, I don't know if he does anymore, owned Barnes and Noble as time went on. So anyway, that store closed, and then I was moved to another store down in Salem, which is a state capital of Oregon, and that's when I got my first store as a store manager, and that one was called Babbage's. And it was kind of confusing, I know, because I mean, these are older names, and some of the people in here in the chat might recognize what I'm talking about. Babbage's, EB Games is another one. And so EB Games was always our competitor at that time. And then eventually they took the name Software Etc. and Babbage's and said, we need to come up with something different, something that combines the two, and that's where GameStop came from. So when I started there, it was Super Nintendo was still, I mean, they were still selling new Super Nintendo cartridges. That's the time frame when I started. It was like Super Nintendo was almost done. 3DO, which I don't know if you know what that one is. 3DO, it was by Panasonic, and Gold Star made versions of that machine.
Oh, okay.
Very, very shortly after that, the Sega Saturn, and then Sega Saturn and PlayStation. And Sega Saturn, PlayStation, Nintendo. Those were the ones that were coming out then. So that was kind of my time frame when I got involved. So it was really interesting because, and not a lot of people know this either, but I was sitting at the store, and all of a sudden, the new games never showed up. And this is PlayStation came out, and there was no new games that were supposed to come out. It was called Twisted Metal, and it was a big game for PlayStation. It never showed up. I'm like, why didn't the game show up? There's no reason for it why it didn't show up. Next day comes, still didn't show up. We get a phone call, Software Etc. Babbage's has just filed bankruptcy. And so Software Etc. and GameStop were on the verge of just closing shop and shutting the doors. And I'm kind of jumping around the timeline as it pops into my head, but and we're like, oh crap, are we going to get paid? That's why the games aren't coming in, because they just filed for bankruptcy. And that's at the same time the guy owned Barnes & Noble, owned Software. It's two separate companies. So he took the Software Etc. and the Babbage's, and he sold it to Barnes & Noble, because a company and a person who owns a company are two separate things. And he sold the company to Barnes & Noble. So then it was purely Barnes & Noble owned those things. And then he reworked it. It's kind of fishy. It's really complicated. But basically, he took money out of one pocket and stuck it to another pocket, his same pants. And he ended up making a ton of money. And then from there became GameStop. And then the PlayStation took off. And then it was off to the races from there, because PlayStation just boomed and saved the market. Nintendo started going heavy, and then Xbox started going heavy as well. So, I mean, but there was a time when there was like a 2-month period when GameStop, before they were GameStop, almost never existed.
Dang, man.
Which might have been a good thing, to be totally honest.
Okay. I'm gonna pop away real quick.
You don't have to pop away. He's right here.
Well, but he should have the center spotlight. That's the point.
All right, so welcome to BBA 99's Fire Facts. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to complete this course while I name my Fire Facts. All right, so number 1, Bueller has a cat named Nipples. Number 2, Nintendo and Sony wanted to work together. Sony developed the drive, and Nintendo didn't use it, so Sony used it, making the PlayStation. And number 3, Mario's full name is Mario. Now I need to go complete this course.
Quick switcheroo. We need to create an animation to drop bombs, so it's just here.
Drop the mic.
So I have to ask real quick, just complete segue, and I mean the show is very good at segues. Why is your cat's name Nipples?
So it started off as a joke, to be totally honest, and it was her original name was Lilu, and I named her after the character from The Fifth Element.
Okay.
And anyway, it was Mother's Day a few years back, and my mother is a hairdresser, and she does this lady's hair. This older lady, I'm blanking on her name, but I've never liked this lady, and I know it's horrible to not like older ladies or old people, but this lady just drove me nuts, and she always just took advantage of my mom and stuff, and kind of, wasn't very grateful for what my mom did for her. So I never liked hanging out with this lady, but yet she would always, my mom felt bad, so she'd come to dinners with us, or family get-togethers, Christmas. Yeah. Elaine, her name is Elaine. That's right. So anyway. Elaine shows up at this Mother's Day dinner that we're having for my mom. My mom went and got her, and she's like, "Oh, I heard you found I heard you got a new cat," and I just wanted to say something to throw her off, And she's like, "Oh, what's the name of the cat?" And I go, "Nipples." Like everyone has nipples. And she looks at me and she's like, "What?" Because I didn't want her to talk to me anymore, so I just threw that out there, and then. That's really how the name came. It was literally a joke. So this old lady wouldn't talk to me because I didn't want to talk to her. And then my siblings started calling the cat Nipples, and it kind of stuck, Nipples. And my nieces and nephews started calling her Nipples. And then from that day forward, she was always referred to as Nipples the cat. So basically, it stemmed from the fact that I didn't want to talk to a nasty old lady. So I tried to make her feel uncomfortable so she wouldn't talk to me.
Did it work?
What's that?
Did it work?
It worked great. It worked great. Well, the first thing she said, "Oh, nibbles." She thought I said nibbles, like
So
nibbling
did
on
I.
something. And I go, "No, it's not nibbles." I go, "Nipple. Like you have nipples, I have nipples." And then she was like, "Oh, that's nice." And then she didn't say a word to me the rest of the night.
There you go.
And my mom was sitting there like, "Oh my God." She hates it. She hates it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, no, because I heard them talking about it, and I just heard it out of context. I'm like, oh, his cat's name is Nibbles, because I thought I had heard it with a P. That can't be right. I must not have heard that right. So I'm like, Nibbles? Is that the name? And they're like, no.
No, that's nipples. Nipples.
She's actually a beautiful cat.
Yeah, she's not bad. She's a little self-conscious, but that's all right.
Okay. Back to gaming.
All right.
So
You should turn
Right.
around and show them what you're doing right now.
I'm playing
yeah.
a speed
No,
running
he's
course.
here. He's legit playing games over my shoulder.
Nice.
Oh, it turned off. What
No,
did
it
I
didn't turn
oh,
off. Yeah.
Nintendo Switch goodness. Very cool.
There you go. Okay. So I wanted to ask, while you were working at GameStop, I wanted to ask you, what were some of your favorite things about working there? What did you like the most about working there?
Well, I worked there twice, and here's the thing: I worked there. I want to let that be known. I worked there for once. I worked there for like an 8-year period, and then I left for a couple years, and I came back for another 2-year period. They wanted me back. So I had 2 different experiences when I was there. The first time I was there for the 8 years, and that's the one I enjoy the most. Some really great people that I met, and actually I met a lot of actually my assistant manager. His name was Dean. He went on to be a programmer and like the lead for Sony for developing games. I mean, if you've ever played God of War, the latest God of War, he's like the main guy on that team for God of War. And so I met a few people in the industry and stuff, which is just great. So I really enjoyed the first 8 years. And at the time, the company was really good to its employees. And I felt as though I was being paid appropriately, which not a lot of GameStop employees can say right now, which is unfortunate. But they were very. My district manager was really nice. There was a lot of fun times going on in the gaming industry with the PlayStation and then the Nintendo 64. We'd do tournaments and we'd have different contests. There was always the we were like asking people to reserve games and stuff. And at that time, there was no digital games, so it was a viable option, for people who want to get into games, because they could only buy the physical media, which is great. One thing I do want to be totally honest with, and this is kind of horrible, but the first 8 years, and GameStop has always gotten a really bad reputation on used games and their prices, or what they give you for used games. And a little history lesson on that. GameStop didn't always do used games in-house. They actually outsourced that to a company that would send them used games and they would sell. So we would take games in and we would send them to a third-party company. They'd package them up and they'd come back. Now, this is really early on. The people at GameStop said, why are we using this third-party company? We need to do something ourselves so we're not, splitting the profit. So what they did, they reached out to some different managers throughout the company, and they wanted to make this used game commission to figure out how they would run the used game industry for GameStop. I was a founding member of that used game commission. so there was 4 of us, and I was one of the 4 that was on the committee giving advice what to do, how to do trade in the games, the different slogans, what the return policy is and all that stuff. So I was one of the guys that were in there pitching all that stuff and trying to do right by it and everything. So that was an interesting time.
Wow.
So at the beginning, it was a lot better than it is now. So I'll take credit from the beginning part, but right now it's really bad, which is unfortunate the way it went. But it was interesting being a part of that phone call. It was every Monday and every Friday. We had a 2-hour sit down phone call on putting this together, then rolling it out to other stores within the company and stuff. But I just wanted to put that out there. So I was a little bit involved in that, but it was really good. That first 8 years was great. I really enjoyed it. I left because of some family things I had to take care of, and they were totally okay with that. And they were more than good to me. You know, I got bonuses all the time, big bonuses, thousands and thousands of dollar bonuses from them.
Damn.
And I got an opportunity to travel all over the country because of some of the places they sent me, and which is just great. Now, 2 years later, when I decided to come back, a lot changed. And when I got back into it, they had the magazine subscription, the Game Informer thing. They had the pre-order thing, the trade-in thing, and all sorts of different things were going on. And I was like, God, what happened? And more familiar with how it is now. And I really thought it was kind of shady. And I didn't like the business practices, how they changed over those last 2 years. I didn't like the fact that they weren't giving hardly any value for used games. They were pushing the reserve the game or you're not going to get it type thing. That was like the slogan. And it was just, I just didn't like it. So for those 2 years when I was back, the way that they shifted was just horrible. And during that time, the owner of the company, which I think had changed hands, he was like caught on a hot mic saying how his employees, the managers, the store associates are worthless and they're a dime a dozen.
Okay.
And on a hot mic, and it was recorded and it circulated around to all the stores to hear the president of the company just telling you guys how worthless you are.
Oh, no.
So I was looking forward to getting out of there as soon as I can, and I did. As soon as I was able to get out, at a good place to go to make some decent money, I was like, yeah, I'm leaving. But and then since then, GameStop has just gone even more downhill. And totally honest, I really hope that they close. I think their business practices are so bad right now. It's not the type of business that should be around. There should be a different business come in and take over and do it a lot better.
Wow. Dang. And see, that's some of the stuff you wouldn't even think about because it's just like a customer who walks in looking for a random game.
We shop there.
We shop there all the time. This little one's a little bit obsessed.
Yeah.
But you would have no idea walking in what kind of business practices, what was some of the stuff that went behind the scenes as far as, the company coming to be. And then, when it changed hands, how, the president of the company, acted and behaved. That's something you wouldn't know as someone just on the street coming in.
Well, I mentioned a bonus, and I'll just be honest about this. Like I said earlier, the owner, how he sold the company to Barnes and Noble, and he took money from one hand to another. He took money
Right.
from one pocket to another pocket, and he made a ton of money off this, and it was really shady. So he got kind of hit from the government. So he said that he was going to give back to the stores and stuff because it was kind of a, I don't know what you call it, but insider trading almost. He not only did. I'll just put it to you this way. I got a $10,000 bonus because of that.
Holy buckets.
Yeah. And I wasn't the only one. It was literally like he made so much money selling one of his companies to another company and back and forth that he was it was rough. And they were coming down on him. He had to liquidate a bunch of that funds, and how he did that was he just gave bonuses to people in the company. And what it was based on how long you'd been there. So if you'd been there 1 year, you got $2,500, 2 years, $5,000, 3 years, $7,500, and over 4 years, you got $10,000. And I had been there about 5 years at that time. So I got the full $10,000 Plus, I got about $10,000 in stock options as well. And so they're like trying to make themselves look better because of what the shady business practice was of, selling one company to your other company and making the profits. Yeah. But that was well before, that was a long time ago. I mean, that was quite a while
And if
ago.
you think about that for a second, if you think about, like how many employees, were employed for each of these, each of the buildings in each of the states, the fact that he could just probably hand out anywhere between $2,500 to $10,000
Yeah.
to multiple employees, to multiple buildings, to multiple states.
Yeah. He made a lot of money on that
You
transaction.
do that math alone, and that just tells you how much he made doing that.
Well, I mean, to go from being on the verge of bankruptcy to selling that company to another company and making that much money to where you have to share it with pretty much everyone who's employed, that should tell you something. I mean, I didn't mind. I mean, don't get me wrong. I walked in and said, "Oh, you're getting your bonus today," and we didn't have any idea what it was going to be. And then here's a $10,000 check. And I was like, "Oh, that's pretty good,"
Oh my gosh! Like no arguments. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrapped up is I wanted to ask because I know you've been telling us about like the business end of it, but I wanted to ask if you had any personal stories from working there that sticks out in your mind after all this time. Any personal stories?
I do have a few, and they're not really game related, but they're related to my customer base that would come in. Where my store was located, I was at the majority of the time was at a mall called Lloyd Center, which is right in like downtown Portland area. And my clientele at that time were like NBA players from the Blazers. And so I knew almost every single Blazer on the team at that time. They would come in on a weekly basis and buy games.
Wow.
And not only that, but like other teams would come into town and they would hang out and they would come with them. So I got to meet all these wonderful NBA players. There was, I remember, you might not know who this guy is, but his name was Jermaine O'Neal, and he was he played for the Blazers, and he went on to be an all-star for Indiana and stuff. Wow. He was such a nice guy, and he was actually drafted out of high school at 18. I remember I met him when he turned 19. He came in and he bought a Nintendo 64 from me, and he didn't know how to fill out a check. So I had to show him how to fill out his check to pay for the Nintendo 64 and stuff. So him and I became friends, and he was on the list when he's like, "Hey, let me know when you get this game in, I'll come pick it up." So they would give us free tickets and stuff all the time to go check out the games, and I would meet different NBA players. The one that stands out the most, I was always a huge Michael Jordan fan and Chicago Bulls fan. Never got to meet Michael Jordan. Met Scottie Pippen because he played for the Blazers as well, so I met him a few times. Wow. But there was one time that there was this NBA player. His name was James Edwards. Not a very well-known player, but he played center for the Detroit Pistons, and then he also played center for the Chicago Bulls when they won their championships. And he came in one day because he lived up in Washington, I believe. And he came in, and I noticed him right away, and he'd been retired for a couple of years. And he walks up, and I'm helping him, and I look down, and he's got the championship ring on his finger from the previous couple seasons, the same ring that Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, and all these guys have. And he's got this ring on his finger. I go, "Is that the championship ring?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "Man, that's awesome." He takes it off his hand, and he hands it to me and tells me to put it on. Yeah. And so, I mean, this guy's like 7'2", big, huge guy. So he hands over this ring that literally weighs like a pound or a half or whatnot. And I might put the championship ring on my finger, and I'm like looking at it, and I'm like, there's only like a handful of these rings. There's only like 15 of these rings out there. The only other people that have them are Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, and here I am wearing it. And it was I thanked them so much for letting me wear it for a minute, and I talked to him. I got on the phone and called my dad, like right after he left. I said, Dad, I go, "You're not going to believe it, but James Edward was here and he let me wear the Chicago Bulls championship ring.
Wow.
And he's like, "Are you kidding?" Because he's a big fan too. I'm like, "Yeah, man, it was so cool." So that's probably the one. Like I said, it's not really game related, but honestly, that time that'll stay with me forever. So
That's a wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, blows my mind. That is not where I was expecting this to go at all. You know, when I was asking personal stories, I almost had like the secret thought of, ooh, you know, what retail stories does he have in mind? You know, of just
Of
people
women
that you
kicking
that
over
you got
displays
your
and yes,
you know that
uh-huh.
you got your come up and see the
yeah, that's all boring stuff, man. That's boring stuff. I got plenty of those stories, but I mean, really, it's those ones. You know, it's many a times that you get those retail stories, you get those customers that are out of control. You know, and I had many of those over the years, and employees the same way. And you've probably heard things like that before, but I wanted to share something with maybe you haven't heard. So
That's amazing. Thank
That is
you.
really
That is
cool.
awesome.
It's amazing how much everybody in this community, like people who have met other people and, you know, have gone and seen things that, you know, nobody else would have even thought of, you know, because like this Kavi, he meets so many different people, you know, working for, you know, radio. I'm like, and none of you guys talk about this. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I think that was like the perfect story to end the show off on, man. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
yeah, that's fun.
I had a lot of fun, and I mean, I know we segued a little bit to cats, and
Yeah.
then you know the personal stories, but I mean, the show was just about having fun, and that's what matters. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone who has hopped in the chat. I know I've seen Stay Puff, I've seen Kavi, I've seen people popping in and out. So thank you guys so much for watching, and Bueller, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I had a blast. I like talking about video games, and you know, you gave me an excuse to share one of my favorite stories, so I appreciate that.
I mean, yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for watching, and we will see you all
Later.